So it is 10 o'clock in the morning in Manila. I know that we will have a lot more participants joining in the next couple of minutes, but to ensure that we are actually following our schedule, we would like to start now with this very relevant and interesting webinar. And the question we want to discuss today is, does tourism have a future in the Pacific? This is quite a provocative title for this webinar. And of course, there's a reason for that, because we have very interesting, diverse perspectives here today with us. And before I further continue, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Ashish Narain. He is a principal economist in the Pacific Department at the Asian Development Bank. He has more than 10 years experience working on sustainable tourism. It's one of his passion areas. And together with Ashish, we worked on new perspectives for tourism and use future thinking foresight, but I don't want to already reveal too much. So now handing over to Ashish. Please, Ashish, give us a little bit of background why we are here today and what we want to achieve with this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Susan. I hope I'm audible and visible.
Yes, yes, we can see you and hear you.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from wherever you're joining, and welcome to the webinar, Does Tourism Have a Future in the Pacific? If you're here, you most likely know how important tourism is to the economies in the region. Before the pandemic, the sector generated almost $4 billion worth of business for the Pacific and accounted for about 8% of GDP and employed more than 90,000 people. The recovery of many of our regional economies will still depend on the revival of tourism. However, the pandemic has also exposed many of the underlying weaknesses and created enormous uncertainty about the pace and nature that any recovery will take. Just to note some of the weaknesses, one is the concentration of markets. In 2018, almost 50% of tourists to the Pacific came from just two countries, Australia and New Zealand. Add to this the US and that becomes 60%. This means that Pacific tourism is very dependent on what happens in just a handful of countries. Two, more than 60% of tourism is leisure tourism. But the pandemic has turned what was the Pacific's main selling point, its remoteness, into a potential risk. How this will be factored into people's decision is still unknown. And quite likely the impact will vary across countries. We're seeing good revival in some countries like Fiji, but not so a stronger revival in others. A third weakness is the uncertainty around the supporting hard and soft infrastructure. Most tourists arrive on planes, but the area is serviced by a relatively small number of airlines, and many of these are facing stress. Shipping lines are also cutting service and raising costs. Within the countries, the private sector, especially the SMEs, have been deeply scarred by the pandemic in these last 2 years. And finally, we can't forget the environmental and climate risks. The carrying capacity of the Pacific is limited, and climate change may bring this down even more. The situation has also exposed some weaknesses in our arsenal. All planning is future looking. But as an economist, I'm trained to look at the past to a certain trends. Now, there may still be valuable lessons that can be learned from the past, but what do we do when we expect fundamental changes to have happened? An alternative is to imagine different scenarios and use this to think of strategies and actions that can increase the chances of reaching positive outcomes, but minimize the chances of landing on the not so desirable outcomes. And finally, there's also an opportunity to rethink and reimagine, hoping that tourism will serve better the development needs of our Pacific countries. And it should be environmentally and socially sustainable. So in this workshop, we are bringing together speakers who have looked at tourism from each of these angles. We also have in the audience policymakers and stakeholders from the region and outside who know the sector very, very well. We hope that with the different approaches of the speakers, along with the valuable inputs and feedback from the participants, we will be able to collectively think of a way forward. The ADB is, of course, very happy to support governments, however it can, in their efforts to revive tourism in the region. So with that, we look forward to your very active participation and discussion. Welcome again to the workshop. And back to you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashish. Great introduction. And before we start, I want to say that this is a webinar that we are doing jointly with the Victoria University of Wellington. And we thank Professor Ian Newman for being here and working with us. And we hope that many students and the academia, of course, also benefits from this deep conversation. I would also like to mention that all of you can please interact with us through question and answer. It's a webinar, but we hope that there will be more interactive workshops following here so that we can really co-create a good support approach for our member countries in the Pacific. So please don't hesitate, interact with us, question and answers, and our experts will respond to them. And we also have, of course, a discussion and conversation later. Please, don't hesitate to ask provocative questions. This is why we are all here. And now let's start with the discussion, and especially with the, with the content that we want to share with you first. So let me introduce to you Sarah Curry. She is a tourism expert in the Pacific Private Sector Department. This shows, of course, also how important the private sector involvement is in the tourism development, and especially in sustainable tourism development. And we want to kick off this talk show with Sarah to share with us some of the insights and challenges and the way forward that she is seeing in her role working with the ADB. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, Ashish. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here today. Thank you for having me. As mentioned, my name is Sarah Curry and I'm the tourism specialist for ADB's Pacific Private Sector Development Initiative, PSDI. I'll be talking today on work based on work I undertook last year, Looking Forward, Volume 1, which was a document we prepared to evaluate the challenges for Pacific tourism after COVID-19. And the document relied very heavily on 2019 data, I guess looking at tourism pre-pandemic, knowing that possibly the tourism industry in the Pacific will never really be the same again after COVID-19. And what we found is, of course, that Pacific tourism, the various islands have shared advantages, as we well know, beautiful beaches, idyllic reefs, culture, and incredible places for holidays, but that they also share a number of significant challenges. As we all know, it's not easy to do business in the Pacific. Access to markets is difficult and costs are high. It can be difficult to access finance and access labor for tourism. There are issues of connectivity. Both getting to the region can be expensive from the major source markets, but also interregional connectivity is often very difficult, limiting multi-destination itineraries. A lot of tourists will travel to one Pacific island and then head straight back home, spending less time in the region than they possibly might otherwise if connectivity were easier. We also found in the report, as again, we all well know, that data often fails to capture the full benefits of tourism. And this is a challenge that is not unique to the Pacific. It's a challenge of destinations worldwide, that tourism is heavily reliant on arrival figures, looking at the number of tourists per year, but essentially that really masks more useful indicators, which is the value that tourism brings, economic value, and the spread of those benefits, but also weighing those benefits against the costs of tourism. And Ashish mentioned that climate change is obviously very prevalent in the Pacific. Environmental impacts of tourism are significant, so any benefit of tourism needs to be weighted against its costs. And this wasn't always the case pre-COVID. And I guess that speaks to the point of the spread of the benefit and the inclusivity of tourism. Tourism is going to be a valuable tool for development. It needs to benefit marginalized communities, regional communities. It needs to be inclusive. And without being able to measure that, it was always in doubt as to how well tourism was serving the Pacific as a tool for development. And then on top of that came COVID-19, which has presented significant new challenges for the Pacific tourism industry and tourism globally. And these questions of resilience and the diversification, the need for diversification, which have always been discussed for tourism, have now been brought very much to the fore. Obviously, tourism is not quite the resilient sector we thought, and the need to diversify both to other sectors and within the tourism sector has become more prevalent than ever. And so as now we're looking to reopening tourism, and it becomes not just a case of the logistics of reopening, which of course are enormously challenging, but also going back to some of those earlier challenges and looking at how this might exacerbate those. So for example, Fiji has done an incredible effort in reopening for tourism in a very short space of time at the end of last year. But for smaller economies in the Pacific who have staff of 2 and 3 people in their national tourism offices, it's incredibly challenging to be able to put significant protocols in place. Suddenly, health protocols have come to the fore, things we've never had to look at before, and the enormity of this challenge is compounding reopening after 2 years. And even within larger economies such as Fiji, the challenge is greater for smaller operators, family-run enterprises that don't have the resources necessarily to put together all the protocols and necessary measures for reopening, putting them at further disadvantage. We also saw pre-pandemic that visitor dispersal was a significant issue, getting people out of the main tourist centres and into the more remote regions. Now, what we're finding, obviously, with COVID-19 is that when people arrive in a destination such as Fiji for testing and tracing, they need to spend time in a resort centre initially. Often at the end of their journey, they need to retest, which means that if you've only got a week of travel, getting out into the more remote areas is going to be even more difficult. Plus, people are, of course, nervous about spreading COVID. So that idea of the spread of tourism and getting people out is going to be even more difficult post-pandemic. What we're not seeing yet, but what is a threat, is potential price cutting, destinations competing on price to capture those early tourist flows. And once prices are set, they become a tourist expectation. And I mean, obviously, further to that, destinations do need to recover and actually capture revenues rather than taking minimal just to get people back. And that's where regional collaboration is going to be really important. As we've heard since the start of the pandemic, we've always talked about this build back better. First few months in, started thinking COVID has been damaging for tourism, but it's okay, we'll take this time, we'll build back better. But what does it actually look like? And it's one of those things that's very much easier said than done. And the challenge that a lot of Pacific Island countries are facing is this need to balance economic advancement, which is after 2 years of being closed, getting tourists back at all costs, with this need for greater sustainability. And obviously, sustainability was such a focus pre-pandemic, but how can that be balanced when tourists do need to come back to keep economies functioning? And we're seeing different countries in the Pacific managing this challenge in different ways. In the Cook Islands, for example, there's a very successful travel bubble with New Zealand last year, albeit short-lived, but tourists came back in their droves, resorts were filled, money was coming back in. But environmental degradation was noticed even in that short time. Waterways had become more polluted as the island of Rarotonga again began to get close to its carrying capacity. Vanuatu, by example, is taking a different approach and really focusing on sustainability, but this is causing all sorts of challenges for private sector operators who simply can't afford to stay afloat beyond this 2-year period if borders don't reopen soon. And then, of course, in Tonga, we've seen that COVID-19 pandemic is not the only challenge facing Pacific Island countries with reopening. Climate change and natural disasters are still an ever-present, just further compounding the challenges of successful tourism industries in the Pacific. So the report I mentioned earlier, which I will talk about in a little bit more detail at the end, put forward some recommendations for recovery and resilience for the Pacific tourism industry. They were just suggestions, and we will be following up with a second volume, digging further into this topic. But essentially at the end, the report asked, well, what steps must we take or can we take if we're to build back better? And it looked at 5 key areas. So the first was around enabling sustainable private sector-led tourism. So we know that building more dynamic private sectors can lead to higher employment and to incomes. We also know that private sector will be at the forefront of reopening. So new protocols, health and safety measures, so they really need to be supported. And the pandemic has highlighted outdated legal frameworks, cumbersome licensing and registration, fluctuating regulatory requirements, also opportunities for digitization. We also know that access to finance will be critical for both recovery and long-term sustainability of the sector. We could also consider blue financing mechanisms. And tourism taxation will also be vital for supporting a profitable sector once tourism resumes. So these are some of the enabling factors that could be looked at now to support more sustainable tourism in the long run. Building resilience. We all know how important this is and it has been talked about for a long time. And of course, now COVID really brings this to the fore. So how can we build resilience? Well, source market diversification, which Ashish spoke about earlier, is of course one way. It supports seasonality and it stops reliance on a few key markets. And this is something a number of Pacific countries have and continue to look at. Also looking at lower impact, higher spend markets. So for example, yacht visitors over cruise arrivals would be a more resilient strategy. Yacht visitors stay longer, they spend more, their environmental impact is less, and in a lot of cases, they spend more time in outer islands that air and cruise visitors can't often reach. Greater resilience can also be achieved by extending the length of stay and spend of existing visitors. One way to do that is through additional paid activities, for example. Niue, and this is pre-pandemic, became a dark sky place and developed astro tours of the dark skies. This not only attracted more visitors, but kept visitors longer and increased their spend. There's also opportunities post-COVID for more digital travel, remote working, getting tourists in and keeping them for 3-4 months. Their daily spend might be lower, but their overall spend will be higher. And then of course, we get back to data and evidence-based planning. And it's a big contention of the report that robust indicators are just vital for measuring the value of tourism. And that looks at improving economic indicators, employment data, but also assessing the extent of economic leakage and the disaggregation of that data, for example, by gender, to get a true picture of the value of tourism. And then also measuring that value alongside the cost. So the impact on supporting infrastructure, looking at environmental and social indicators, and conducting carrying capacity studies, and having a clear sense of just how much an island can actually carry for tourism, and then using that to guide segmentation, destination marketing, and pricing, and using that in strategic plans to measure against that progress. Sustainability, it shouldn't be just a plan or a concept, it should be a given. If it's not sustainable, it's not worth doing. And we know that sustainability initiatives can attract environmentally responsible tourists, which is a plus as well. Palau is a great example of that. The marine protected area in the Palau Pledge, while both environmental initiatives have actually been seen to attract more tourists. And finally, a regional approach. In times of crisis, I think cooperation can bring greater rewards than competition. And this is also a big contention of the report, that a collaborative approach to the big challenges, such as crisis mitigation and recovery, future resilience, data analysis, improvements in the enabling environment for tourism, could allow best practice to be shared, resources to be used more efficiently, and productivity to increase. This could extend to cooperation in destination marketing, greater multi-destination itineraries, potentially even to support better air connectivity. And it's great today that you'll hear from Chris Cocker presenting in the 4th session, the CEO of SPTO, which is the Intergovernmental Tourism Organization for the Pacific. So he'll have more to say on this topic, I'm sure, as well. And next slide, this is my second last slide, I think, and then I will wrap up. Very briefly, I work for PSDI, which is the private sector development initiative, as I mentioned, which has been running since 2006. And if we just move to the last slide, I was just going to briefly introduce the publications that we put out last year and put up a website of where these can be accessed, if anyone is interested. We put together a regional report, as I mentioned, with another to follow, but also 14 country snapshots for each of ADB's 14 member countries. And I think we'll be able to put the website up there if anyone wishes to download them. And it's this work that has informed, I guess, our PSDI work plan, which has 4 main areas that respond directly to the recommendations in that report. Crisis management and resilience, financing sustainable tourism, which is includes access to finance, tourism taxation, and blue financing, and also around enabling private sector-led tourism. So that work program directly responds to the main recommendations. We work mainly regionally with SPTO as our key partner, but also as a country level as well. And on the final slide, I think there's my email address. I very much welcome any questions or any other points for discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for having me.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So before we move to the next presenter, to Ian, to give very interesting perspectives on the range of futures and scenarios and why this is so important. Now, I have two questions for you, and I want to include them already now. So we see that we are interactive and we were listening to them. So the first question is, with such a limited market already in the Pacific, how can policymakers balance tourism accommodations and the growing presence of Airbnb in a country with a high GDP reliant on tourism receipts? So how do you see the Airbnb industry developing, growing right now in the Pacific?
Thank you. I think that's a great question. And it's actually something we will be looking into in our work program. We're hearing very different reports from the Pacific around Airbnb. I think it has huge potential in recovery. Obviously, it's great that anyone can set up a business, encourage tourism. It also encourages local ownership and regional dispersal, all very good things. Obviously, Airbnb presents some challenges in the regulatory environment in terms of standards and maintaining those, and also collecting taxation from tourism, which has historically been a challenge. Some of the larger operators paying higher fees, it can often be challenging with smaller Airbnb. So I think Airbnb absolutely has a role to play, and certainly in recovery. It's just how governments embrace Airbnb and regulate that industry to maximize the value from it.
Okay, thank you. So maybe more we can hear later from Chris, but what I hear from your talk is we are now creating more evidence. We are collecting more data to actually understand not only the cost of tourism, but also the benefits and how to develop more strategically. So with that, maybe one last question here for you is about taxation. What do you mean with tourism taxation? How does this relate to existing mechanisms like the Environment Climate Adaptation Levy in Fiji?
Yeah, another great question, and thank you. Certainly that's one way to tax tourism is putting the ECAL in Fiji. The taxation can be arrival taxes, paid at the airport, or visa fees, departure taxes. They can be levies such as bed levies or ECAL on costs, or site fees. And I think one thing we can look at in terms of the recovery of tourism post-COVID is what taxation measures are best in terms of sustainability initiatives. Also, what will impact demand. We want to be conscious of demand elasticity, ensuring a destination captures revenue, but is also not perceived as too expensive. And also what might protect sites, such as site fees, adding value to those and ensuring that pricing matches kind of tourist expectations and demand. So PSTI will be conducting a study around tourism taxation to further look into these and provide some recommendations.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. So I think there was one question about opportunities for regional cooperation, regional airlines, and I'll wait for Chris to respond to that. And have a question non-related to the Pacific about reopening in Southeast Asia. Being in the Philippines, I can say Philippines open for tourism, and so are also a few other destinations. But thank you very much, Sarah. So now let's move on and hear from Ian Newman. He is the Associate Professor of Tourism Futures at the Victoria University of Wellington. And when we started to work with Ian last year, we were very excited, Ashish, Bama, and I, because we didn't even know that there's a specialization in futures and tourism. We know futures quite well. ADB has a futures thinking and foresight program, one of the very few ones of multilateral development banks. And we were very, very excited to bring these perspectives, because what we sometimes feel in development is that there is often also toxic optimism about building back better. And there isn't much debate about all the things that could happen and might not be ideal. So we invited Ian to work with us on a few scenarios. And Ian, I'll invite you now to share some of your insights. Ian is very much published. He's an author of books and journals. He is a co-editor of the Journal of Futures Tourism. And we're very happy to have you here, and of course have the collaborating partner, Victoria University of Wellington, here. So over to you, Ian.
Thank you, and kia ora from New Zealand. My name is Ian Newman, and thank you for the introduction. I've got a title there: Does tourism in the Pacific have a future? And fundamentally, it is a provocative title, because with COVID-19, I think we're getting to the point where we have to ask the question: at what point does tourism become unsustainable? Because we live in a world today, and there's lots of things happening that will shape the future of the world in tourism. We've had COVID-19 now for 3 years. We're entering a period where inflation's now running between 5 and 8% in many countries of the world. And we're on the cusp of Russia invading Ukraine, and what the consequences for that will be, we will not know. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and all of these external factors shape the future of tourism. So let's start with looking at COVID-19. So that becomes the starting point. And it's COVID-19's becoming the starting point. And if we look at it, and to me, it's a matter of consciousness. COVID-19 as a pandemic or an influenza is not new. The world has had a history of these type of events in the past. And if we go back about 100 years ago, we can now recall what the consequences of people traveling, the end of the First World War, and Spanish flu. We've had SARS-1. So we've had all of this, but it's a matter of consciousness. Because in the last 10, 15 years, from a tourism perspective, all we've seen is continued growth, and any disruption into tourism has been minimalistic. So this brings me to me, and I actually wrote a paper back in 2006 when I was the scenario planner at Visit Scotland, the Scottish Tourist Board's research department. And I did two scenarios. One scenario was about avian flu, what happened in Hong Kong, what the impact could be on Scottish tourism. But the second scenario was, what happens if SARS-1 had mutated? What happens if it turned into this epidemic, into this pandemic that we're facing? And 15, 16 years later, that has now come to fruition. So looking at the past is extremely important. So when I set out to do a set of scenarios, which I'll introduce in a moment, I looked at what had been published and what had been said. And the one person I need to thank is Professor Albert Posman at the European Tourism Futures Institute in the Netherlands, who's been very prolific in some of the writings from that institutions, writing about COVID-19 and tourism. So in order to look at the future, what I tend to do is I frame the future. Because one of the golden rules of futures work is there's not one future, but a multitude of future, because nobody can predict an exact future. Because if you could predict an exact future, I would know the lottery numbers for this weekend. So you tend to ask questions in the terms of what are the key determinants that will shape this future in the terms of going forward. And from a COVID-19 perspective, it's all about where will COVID-19 will go. Will it linger? Will it go on and on and on? And there's a number of publications that say that. Or will it just, after Omicron, will it just fade away? Is Omicron the last major variant, and everything else like that next is just a more milder influenza? The other thing to consider is tourism's about the tourist and how the tourist behaves. It's also about us and how we behave and how we react to the environment of COVID-19. So do we have a tourist that's very eccentric and thinking about themselves, so very hedonistic behavior? Or do we consider a more wider perspective in the terms of cooperation and the importance of community? So if you take those two drivers of change or trends and the range of different outputs, you get faux scenarios. So you get faux scenarios, and these faux scenarios are basically the same story, but there's different outcomes. It's like going to the movies, but there's 4 different endings. The movie is about COVID-19, but we don't know what the end's going to be. So the 4 endings that I've got are, one's about the roaring 20s and continued growth. We get back to COVID-19, we go back to pre-COVID-19 days. We've got a future that's about a regenerative future and transformation. We've got a future that's about the end of tourism, the end of mass tourism in the Pacific, the unthinkable question, collapse. And we've got another scenario, which is called faded resource. This is about trying to live with COVID-19 over the next 5, 6 years. It never disappears, there's more mutations. So let's delve into some more detail regarding these scenarios. So basically, what do these scenarios represent? Roaring 20s is a story. It's a story that fundamentally says Omicron is the last variant. It's more mild as we go along. And what happens next is all of these frustrated tourists around the world, this pent-up demand to travel. So what we're seeing in the Pacific in a very relatively short period is basically the doubling of the economic value of tourism doubling overnight, from 2.69 billion in 2019 to 5.5 billion by the year 2030. Another scenario is what we call a regenerative future, because when you have dystopia, COVID-19, a bad future, we start to think about we want a better world, we become more optimistic. So the focus across the world in response to, from a strategy perspective and a policy perspective, is a strong focus on community tourism, sustainability, and a regeneration, trying to think about community projects, balancing resort development, small scale projects, and creating positive outcomes. Whereas another scenario is the end of mass tourism. This presumes the combination of factors of climate change in the Pacific Islands becoming a lot more disruptive and COVID-19. And it takes us to the point where tourism in those islands becomes unsustainable. There's no point in being in that industry. Those two elements have beaten us. So we're seeing the end of mass tourism, the end of long haul travel into those islands, because it's just not economically viable. Whereas faded resorts, as COVID-19 does not go away, there's more, we're going to lockdown, we're out lockdown, we've got restrictions, we haven't. The market becomes, and because the Pacific Islands rely on Australia, New Zealand, and that long haul, medium haul travel, that international travel, it just becomes, we're not getting there. People are staying at home. So the Pacific Islands are working hard, but it's fundamentally because of the lack of tourists, you get this spiral down effect. The Pacific Islands become second class, second choice destinations because they haven't got the continued investment. And some of the big players and branded players like Accor and Hilton pull out. So you've got four scenarios there that are different endings to the story in the terms of where it will go. Each of those scenarios asks a question. What is the central proposition of the four scenarios? So scenario one, Roaring 20s, goes back to 2019. It's the concept of over-tourism. How do you manage for the boom? So it's about capacity management, infrastructure investment. Regenerative future scenario says, how do you build better? How do you build a better future? The faded resort scenario basically says, what are the uncomfortable decisions we need to take in order to avoid the end? How do we live with COVID-19? And the end of mass tourism scenario asks the question for policymakers, at what point in the future do we just give up? At what point in the future does tourism become unsustainable that we have to withdraw from that market? It's just not worth it. Tourism's the dead donkey. So imagine this is the end. Imagine this story, this scenario is the output. It's the ending. So as a policymakers, what would your policy responses be in the terms of decisions you would take? So in the Roaring 20s scenario, it's a focus on growth. So it's about dealing with capacity levels. It's about infrastructure and investment. It asks questions about how do you fund that future in the terms of FDIs. And it's about how do you regulate and monitor that capacity management issue. Whereas the faded resort scenario is all about dealing with the implementation of health and hygiene protocols of what many destinations are doing at the moment. It means connection with your key tourist markets, but the emphasis changes. It's about value and price. And because you've got a decline of tourism in this scenario, incremental design, you start to think the unthinkable. You start to think about tourism in its wider context. So for example, new products and experiences, where would you delve into something like casino and gaming tourism and the consequences of that in the terms of the social consequences and the economic consequences? Whereas a regenerative future is thinking about building back better, as the previous speaker talked about, Sarah. It's about focus on the value chain. wealth creation, decent jobs, incentivizing sustainability and penalizing unsustainable behavior. It's about measuring, monitoring, and evaluating the impact of tourism from an SDG perspective. Whereas the end of mass tourism and its collapse is an exit strategy. It's about what is your strategy to withdraw? How do you gradually decline and come out of tourism? And at the same time, grow other industries like digital economy, financial services, farming, fishing, and migration. However, in this scenario, there still probably would be some tourism in the terms of niche market or whole island tourism. And finally, I just wanted to say, my concluding slide was, there's 4 scenarios there. I'm not saying which scenario is going to happen, but one of the things to remember is each of those scenarios is a living document. Each of those scenarios are for you to work with and respond to. Each of those scenarios is about your input. Each of those scenarios is about you adding value and changing things around. They're a thinking document. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. This was a great reality check, right? How important it is about these different scenarios. One question to you already, because we moved to Johanna, and that is our governments in the Pacific using future thinking, foresight processes and scenarios to kind of develop various perspectives and not just one, the Build Back Better and regenerative one?
Well, I think from a policymaker's thing, the focus has been in the last couple of years about the future that they want, the preferred future. And that future is, in the terms of the strategic perspective, has been that regenerative tourism perspective. So that's what's happening on one example. But on a day-to-day basis, destination responses have been, we're in this scenario of faded resorts. We're living with COVID-19. So the response has been health and safety protocols and that type of thing. So they're working operationally within the faded resort scenario. And from a more long-term perspective, they're tending to work within this regenerative futures perspective. But if you're asking the question, are many Pacific Islands or destinations using the concepts of scenario planning, the answer is probably not.
Okay, thank you. I think this is what you just said is a great pathway. Anna's input and present, because you just said, Ian, we are actually operating right now in the faded resort, in the very kind of limited tourism area, a tourism scenario, and we want to transition to this regenerative pathway. So it would be great to hear from Johanna and her work about how this can happen, should happen, and what it requires in terms of policies and investments and support also from developing member countries, but also, of course, from development organizations like our own, the Asian Development Bank. So, Johanna, over to you. We're looking forward to sharing some of your insights from your latest work.
Thanks, Susan, for the introduction. Yeah, so my name is Dr. Johanna Le. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Griffith Institute for Tourism. And today I'm sharing findings of the report, COVID-19 Impacts and Responses in Asia and the Pacific, which I worked on with Professor Susanne Becken and which was produced by the Asian Development Bank. So my talk will focus on tourism's policy response. So really great, sort of leading on from the question and what Ian just said, and how that is impacting the trajectory of the system. And then from there, where the opportunities lie to enhance tourism's contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals in the Pacific. So just some brief background. Our work is based on the VICE model, so standing for Visitor, Industry, Community and Environment. And it looks at tourism holistically, interconnected with its environment and the host communities, where tourism through all its elements and through an enabling environment, which you see here in white, contributes to all the Sustainable Development Goals without exceeding local or global carrying capacities. The tourism system at large pre-COVID wasn't very sustainable. We've heard about some of the existing challenges amplified through COVID. And However, a crisis is often a time for change, and the recovery now presents an opportunity to transform the system. So now I want to talk about what the tourism policy response was, and whether those policies were actually leading the system to transform. So as part of our work, we conducted an analysis of national tourism policy response measures. And there are three broad categories of policies that you can see here. So there were untargeted support schemes, for example, job retention schemes, sectoral schemes targeted at tourism specifically. So things like specific training programs or supporting tourism crisis committees. And then there were also business support programs, including loans or the nationalization of strategically important firms such as airlines. The measures that we found, they were aimed at creating outcomes at different timescales, ranging from short-term, so really an immediate crisis response, to medium and long-term. So those are focused at creating long-term resilience and sustainability. We found that there were a wide range of measures that focused on securing immediate outcomes. We've heard that already. Health and safety through the closure of borders was still, that's still the case, and providing the fiscal or monetary support to keep businesses afloat. So the key policy focus was really to re-establish business as usual as quickly as possible. And here I'm referring to the old paradigm on the diagram that you can see here on the slide. Policy responses focus on a medium and especially a longer term outcome were actually less common. Those that we did find were mainly what could be described as bridge builders. So for example, skill and capacity building programs, including retraining workers to potentially work in other sectors, repositioning destinations, and investing in assets. However, there were really very little policies that really took a long-term focus aimed at creating a new system for tourism. So referring to that new paradigm here on that graph. And what we were looking for there was, for example, attaching sustainability criteria to financial support packages, just to give you one example. Is this surprising? Well, similar to tourism's COVID response, existing tourism policy usually doesn't focus on sustainability. Of course, there is exceptions, but really on concepts such as growth, productivity, and competitiveness. And you can see those common policy areas for tourism at the top. Similar to the work that Ian presented, for our report, we also looked at potential futures for tourism, building on the work done by the Forum for the Future, to find out what policy initiatives may prevent or enable certain outcomes. And I don't want to go into any detail here, but what we found is that if we think long-term, enhancing sustainability is really a safe strategy for each of the possible tourism futures. So especially given the current uncertainty, or the uncertainty that we're likely to face for a long time ahead, sustainability offers a proactive and no regret approach. And at the bottom row in green, you can see some suggestions what greening those typical tourism policies may look like. On that, however, I want to say that greening, just a policy here and there, is not sufficient to achieve that transformation, that systemic change. So to build forward and transform the tourism system so it generally contributes to all sustainable development goals, which was the focus of our work. And I think that really refers to Ian's transformation or regeneration scenario here. We need a little bit more. So here, or what I want to say actually before is, achieving such transformation is really challenging for decision makers because it requires a proactive approach and change of key levers. And what you can see here is we've developed a number of different pathways to transform tourism, and each of them has a number of levers. These are points where to intervene in the system. And these levers, there's specific actions. They're still fairly broad. So the full report has specific actions and examples for each of those levers, and they are framed at policymakers. However, I know there's a lot of participants here in the private sector and development partners. So they are also relevant for the private sector and development partners, you know, in terms of individually, but also requiring cooperation between those different stakeholders. Each destination will have different priorities. Each destination faces unique challenges, and governments may focus on the pathways and recommendations that align best with their tourism and development strategies. So this is a long list of recommendations. Not all of them may be relevant. So it's down to the policymakers to look at their priorities and then pick and go from there. So the pathways that we've identified, and Sarah mentioned some similar opportunities, is a value-led tourism model, so really focusing on quality over quantity, and I think relevant for the Pacific, particularly understanding uniqueness of place. There's decarbonizing tourism. Obviously, climate change is a huge challenge. Tourism-led regeneration, Ian's talked about that a little bit. Diversifying the economies, so especially the visitor economy, but potentially also in certain cases away from tourism. And then improving the governance structure of tourism to support long-term planning, and importantly, financing, which will be critical for the implementation of some of the other levers as well. So while there are challenges, and we've heard some of those from Sarah as well, I do think that there is a huge opportunity for destinations in the Pacific to transform their tourism system, especially or in particularly by capitalizing on some of the unique characteristics that are already present. These include the resilience of the people, traditional ways and Indigenous knowledge, which really reflects a holistic understanding that humans and the environment are intrinsically linked. So that is critical if we want to look at tourism as a whole system. And also the opportunity to strengthen regional cooperation. For example, for agreeing on a common goal for sustainable tourism and what that system might look like in the South Pacific. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from our next speaker. So to wrap up, I do want to highlight that there are some exceptions to the common recovery approach that we found. And some countries and destinations are applying a transformative approach. And I want to point out one, that's Vanuatu. They did place a distinct focus on well-being and natural capital in their COVID-19 recovery strategy. That's also supported and underpinned by their sustainable tourism strategy. Sarah did say that obviously that again comes with challenges, but there are also initiatives that do make a difference and that are very promising, such as the average tourism program and their work with Planet Happiness. So the challenge or the question that remains will be whether those countries can actually maintain a very different trajectory being embedded in a global tourism system. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanna. And sorry that I didn't introduce you properly and that you took over there. I think fascinating research. One question I have for you, and we have a few questions also in our Q&A, is what do you think are the success factors that actually drive countries to be very proactive with a more with sustainable tourism approaches in line with a regenerative scenario?
That's a very good question, and I think there's a lot of factors that play into that. I mean, we could look at, you know, bottom up or top down approaches. I think from the cases that we do see, those countries have very strong enabling environments. So I did mention certain things there around governance, you know, data, policy, education, and capacity obviously is there. So factors that, you know, will help destinations or countries to achieve regenerative outcomes could also be supported by the ability or the capacity to apply, you know, what we call holistic approaches. We've heard about a few different ones. So looking at tourism interconnected, having that connection to different sectors, policy integration, I think all of those help to understand how to drive more holistic outcomes. I mean, that's a very broad answer. If you want me to go into more specifics.
No, I think
You
we'll
know,
go into it later in our conversation. And I think this is now perfect timing to invite Chris Cooker, the CEO of the Pacific Tourism Organization, to share kind of the insights, what's happening right now at the level of regional cooperation, how he sees different scenarios already happening, how he sees especially the role of collaboration also at the global and interregional level. And of course, also how he sees the developments from his personal experience coming from the Pacific. He's originally from Tonga, and of course, being in this role already for quite some time. So Chris, I would love to hear from you right now. I see that you've already answered some of the questions that came in, and I think there are many more questions for you to come. So over to you.
Warm Pacific greetings, Suzanne, and thank you very much for this opportunity to ADB. Firstly, I'd like to just start off with who South Pacific Tourism Organization is for our listeners. First, we were established in 1983 and based in Suva, Fiji. We're the only intergovernmental organization that has for the tourism in the region. And our mandate is to market and develop tourism in the Pacific. We have 20 Pacific Island member countries, which are shown on the map, and we have over 100 private sector members. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 in the region itself, comparing 2019 to 2020, and was alluded earlier, I just want to give you, I'm not trying to focus on doom and gloom here, but to just give you a picture. On the tourism receipts, the tourism receipts reduced by about $3.3 billion in this case. And also the tourism contribution to GDP reduced by about 6.5% in this case. Also, the international tourist air arrivals to the Pacific reduced by 82%, and cruise arrivals to the Pacific reduced by 73%. According to the UNWTO, the tourism trends in terms of moving forward are improving in 2022. The international travel with restrictions still will be maintained by both destinations. The reinforcement of COVID-19 testing will happen 2 years after the pandemic, and there will be conscious travel will be advocated. Travel to more distant destinations, but with prolonged durations of stay, will benefit our Pacific Islands. And of course, green travel will be also very important to moving forward, as climate change, as we all know, is a problem that is present and growing, and consumers are becoming more environmentally responsible. And finally, a new trend is adventures, and it's about combining education and holidays for the youngest members of the family. The 2 years that has just bypassed with us in 2019, 2020 has given SPTO the opportunity to reset and rethink and rebuild. We've looked at our strategic plan and revised it, and our new vision is our Pacific Islands empowered by and benefiting from sustainable tourism. Our mission is sustainable tourism development through innovative partnerships, and we have 3 core strategic focus areas: marketing, research and statistics, and sustainable tourism planning and development. These are driven by 3 key strategies and frameworks endorsed by our Council of Tourism Ministers last year: an SPTO digital strategy for the next 5 years, a Pacific tourism statistics strategy for the next 10 years, and a Pacific sustainable tourism policy framework for the next 10 years. In terms of the SPTO's digital strategy, just briefly, it's based on 4 pillars: capability and connections, content and community, technology and infrastructure, and finally, data and insights, which is very crucial in navigating us during these uncertain times. In terms of the Pacific Tourism Statistics Strategy, its vision is an empowered Pacific informed by regular, accessible, and high-quality tourism statistics and intelligence. There are 4 objectives: developing an agreed set of core indicators on sustainable tourism, building collaboration and partnership between users and producers, improving data management processes and procedures, improving the quality, timing, detail, and coverage of national and regional information, and finally, very important, evaluate and improve statistical skills and competencies at SPTO and among our SPTO member countries. The final strategy or framework is our Pacific Tourism Policy Framework. Its vision is we are empowered by and benefiting from tourism that's resilient, prosperous, and inclusive. Goal 1 is prosperous economies. 2 is thriving and inclusive communities. 3 is visible and valued cultures. And finally, goal 4 is healthy islands and oceans. In moving forward, for a post-pandemic, according to SPTO, responsible recovery is a priority. Regional leadership and cooperation driven by SPTO is essential. Digital transformation is very important so that we don't get left behind. Country solutions that will benefit our SPTO Pacific Island member countries, global and regional cooperation, an integrated approach, and committing to measuring sustainability. And finally, sustainable financing from development partners. A call for action from our development partners. As you probably, as alluded earlier, we have 3 strategies. The 2 strategies that we need support for and funding support is the implementation of SPTO's Pacific Tourism Policy Framework, particularly in capacity building to support destination planning and better business practices, the development of a destination development strategies for our countries, and development of high quality, accessible experiences, products, and services that relates to diversification. In terms of the SPTO's Pacific Tourism Statistics Strategy, market research is essential to support destination development and marketing. Data and insights for planning, policy, and decision-making is vital, and providing technical support to improve regional and national systems for the long-term sustainability of tourism programs. In terms of SPTO recovery mechanisms that we've been currently doing in the past year and moving forward, through the US government, we have developed an SMEs Ready Recovery Online Toolkit, which is available for the Pacific's SMEs to build back better. Collaborating with like-minded partners, we have signed MOUs with Forward Keys, MasterCard International, Destination Mekong, and UN SIDS regional organizations, which has an interesting combination of the Indian Ocean Tourism Organization, the Caribbean Tourism Organization, the Asian Travel Association, and the African Tourism Council. This is historical, and we look forward to moving and working together with these key tourism regional organizations. The Pacific Private Sector Development Initiative, Phase 4, is focusing on the tourism private sector, and that is what Sarah's had alluded earlier in the first presentation. We're working with the Republic of Korea on a Pacific Cooperation Tourism Recovery Project, and that is combining trade as well as tourism, export of niche products from the Pacific, as well as promoting the destinations of origin to a upmarket Korean market online. The New Zealand AMFET Phase 2 is funded by the New Zealand government, and that is the Pacific's digital transformation of our tourism sector. This is currently running, and it's an initial stage and will go for 4 years. And finally, sustainable tourism commitments. Global sustainable tourism commitment is essential, and the launch of the Glasgow Declaration on Climate Action in Tourism at COP26 was the first time that SPTO has signed up for a very important commitment and also participation at COP26. And we also have our own Pacific Sustainable Tourism commitments, and 5 of our countries have signed up for that, as well as the rest signing their pledges and moving forward. Finally, in terms of key takeaways to drive Pacific tourism to recover post-pandemic, SPTO, in collaboration with development partners, will lead by resetting through digital transformation, rethinking through innovative collaboration regionally and globally, and rebuilding for responsible, sustainable tourism recovery that depends on research and data and insights. I'd like to end with a quote. We are at the crossroads. We need a paradigm shift. We need to go back to Pacific values because sustainability is at the heart of our belief system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I think this was a fantastic showcasing of what's really happening at the regional level in the Pacific. And while listening to you, and seeing these commitments at the global level, at the regional level, sub-regional and national level, I have already one question for you before we hear more questions from the audience. Do you see any conflict of interest, or not conflict of interest, but a conflict in countries where you see that actually the national population has a core interest in sustainability, whereas maybe foreign investors would like to move quickly to this fast exploitation and back to mass tourism in the Pacific?
I think, Susan, your question can be answered by the individual countries themselves. And it all comes back to what policies that they develop in this case. They have signed up, and our Council of Ministers have endorsed regionally that they are very supportive of sustainable tourism. But I think the challenge now is each country signing up for these commitments in this case and developing their own policies. If you look at 17 of 20 of our Pacific Island member countries, there's probably 5 out of them who have dedicated sustainable tourism policies in this case. So I think at the end of the day, government takes the lead in this because they are the ones who are providing the enabling environment that will also help drive the private sector and also investors in moving forward.
Okay, so this is a very good point. It comes back to national governments in a way. Also, it comes a bit back to the political circumstances, right? And then the political economy in each country. And there I have a question for you. What role does civil society play, for example, and are you collaborating as a regional organization with local civil society to kind of, create that accountability from?
Yeah, thank you so much. Very important question. And, I'll be very honest with you. Our strength is collaborating with government and private sector. And just recently, we've initiated working very closely with civil society, particularly with our focus in supporting community tourism development, because we realize that the civil society has a very strong linkage to the communities. So they will play a very important role if SPTO moving forward in terms of sustainable tourism development.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe one last question before we would like to pin everyone who was part of this webinar and we have a more interactive conversation. One question for you, Chris, is how large is the SPTO staff complement right now? How many people do you have to actually implement these pillars that you described? Data, statistics, the policy aspect, the collaboration, work with other international tourism organizations and the private sector reach out?
At the moment, our core staff is about 12 only, but we rely on innovative partnerships with development partners as well as different key stakeholders. And that's where we find our strength in this case. As you probably know that we're very limited resources, but the New Zealand government funding on digital transformation will enable us to expand our staff to nearly double of it, about 20 moving forward soon.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this was also a very clear key message and call for action. If we really want to see more transformation, we have to support the regional and local tourism outfits, platforms and collaboration platforms, and ensure that they get strengthened and that there's more capacity. Maybe one last question for you, Chris. Is there a lot of, are there many universities in the tourism and also skills development on tourism policy, on sustainable tourism policy to advise governments on these kind of policy pathways?
Another very good question. Well, the largest regional university in the Pacific, the University of South Pacific. So just recently, they've moved into the two areas of learning for tertiary level on sustainable tourism. And I think just recently, they're introducing a postgraduate degree on sustainable tourism. So that will be very helpful. As you probably know, that sustainable tourism is still in an embryonic stage in the Pacific in this case. For SPTO, we didn't establish our sustainable tourism division until 2017. So it's very fresh and new in this case, but we're looking forward to see how it grows and moving forward.
Thank you, Chris. So I think another great area for collaboration. I saw there was a colleague from the Spanish embassy who offered also collaboration from Spain who have engaged in sustainable tourism and many other areas. So that's already good. And hopefully a great result of this webinar here to create more community of practices and networks of people who work in this area and can kind of fertilize each other. So now please all join again. I'll ask Danny and Zheng to pin everyone here. And I've seen that we've already answered many of the questions that were asked, but maybe let's go around one more time and see if you would like to add for everyone's ears here some of the questions you have answered already. So Sarah, I think there were many questions about taxation and how to create the right kind of incentives for the private sector. So how do you see that really developing? Because the cost to enter business in the Pacific is probably high for international partners, while of course we need to also ensure that there are then not just benefits for the international investor, but for local communities. So how do you see the taxation and incentive policy framework moving forward?
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, that's a great and very complex question. I think it certainly does require further investigation in the sense that there are such a range of taxes to be offered. And what we find from tourists is if the tax is often put up front, say a visa fee, and it's arduous to get that visa, it might be a deterrent for a tourist to visit the country. But on the flip side, when tourists are visiting sites and it might be only kind of $5 or $10 to visit UNESCO listed World Heritage sites, that's very undervalued. And, research suggests that people are actually willing to pay more. So I think it's a case of each country looking at the different opportunities to tax tourists and those that are unlikely to affect demand and also protect sites. And once again, to shamelessly plug our upcoming PSDI study, we'll be doing exactly that, partnering with SPTO on a regional level to look at these opportunities, map them out, and provide some recommendations for taxation. It's an area we've heard from a lot of countries in the Pacific want to investigate, but there hasn't actually been much research into this previously. So I think it will be a key part of the Build Back Better.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. So maybe the next question here now is for Johanna. Obviously, sustainable and value-driven tourism is, no, I'm making a hypothesis and you tell me if this is correct, okay? So we could assume that sustainable and value-driven tourism is more expensive than kind of the traditional tourism. Have you done some research to kind of uncover that? Is that a true hypothesis, or would you say no, it's actually not correct and we should demystify these kind of assumptions?
Great question. Well, I think it did, first of all, no research specifically, but I think it really comes down to when you're referring to expensive, are you talking about monetary values, or are we looking at the broader costs and benefits of tourism? So I think all of us touched on this today. The aim of building back, or actually forward better, should be to look at tourism holistically. So we need to go beyond those economic indicators to see how tourism can contribute to well-being and the sustainable development goals. So in that case, being regenerative and taking on that well-being approach will really reduce the negative costs. And with costs here, I mean not just economic costs, but cost on the host communities, on environment, and maximize the benefits. Does that
Thank you very much.
question?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? Because I mean, if we look generally at cost benefits of development programs or projects, we have to rethink that completely, right? Because we have to think about the cost of and the benefits of sustainable planning. We have to think about the benefits from considering climate change, mitigating and adaptation, and so on. So looking at tourism, obviously implying that makes a lot of sense. So a question here now for Chris. Is that already happening? Do you have kind of conversations with countries about cost of kind of regenerating the tourism and the benefits, also considering long-term climate change impacts on some of the Pacific Island countries? And there was a question here also from the audience, right? Will Pacific Island countries be so affected by climate change that tourism might, completely, change because of that externality?
We have not started that yet, but under the Pacific Sustainable Policy Framework, we hope to address that area, and we're welcome to work with a development partner. I think also with the PSDI program, and Sarah, you might expand, it's an area that we would like to look through and look in depth into it under the program with Sarah's as well.
Okay, great point. Thank you, Chris. So now, Ian, we speak a lot about cost benefit for the countries, and when we want to go on this regenerative tourism pathway. What is actually happening at the consumer side, the tourist side? Do you see already a change in mindset among the tourists, that they want to have more value-based tourism, they want to contribute to development, or do you see more trends towards hedonistic, my own experience, my joy, and I don't care about the rest development? What's your sense there, and where's the future going?
There's two things that are happening here. Without doubt, sustainability, concern for the environment, climate change is right in the mindset of the tourist. That's without doubt. If you look at any of the consumer surveys that are going around globally, it's there at the moment around number 2 and number 3. Number 1 at the moment is the economic environment, the fear around COVID-19 and trying to lead a daily life. So that tourist is there. The key question is there are a number of tourists that are very much down that path in the terms of converting our thinking into behavior. So the market segments in terms of the eco-tourist, the tourist which is doing this type of thing is already there, and there are a number of niche markets and a number of markets that are already there. However, the main tourist is still, when I want to go on a holiday to the islands, it's coming from New Zealand and Australia, the United States, and it's fundamentally, I'm going to the resort and I'm going to lie on the beach, in the terms of do that. If you want to really create change from a sustainability and regenerative perspective, it has to be government-led. It has to be policy, because then if you put in that framework to incentivize sustainable behavior but penalize unsustainable behavior, you will get that. So the tourist wants to go to the Pacific Islands fundamentally to lie on the beach, go to the resort, and that is the mainstream market.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So this is interesting, right? Where you say we have to cater to that mainstream market experience, but we have to make sure that experience, the underlying policies are actually sustainable, so that the tourist feels good but gets what they want, but we make sure there is all the regenerative considerations. So I'm looking now at Ashish, and maybe you can give us a little bit of kind of outlook. What will you now do with all of this information and of course the collaborating partners we have already? How will ADB move forward and support the regenerative sustainable tourism in the Pacific?
Thank you, Susan. I think that's a great question again. As far as the ADB is concerned, I mean, some of the questions asked about what about the strategic plan? That's in the domain of the government. The ADB supports through both knowledge generation, building capacity, and in any other form through investment projects that governments might need. We're already doing a lot of tourism, especially building in environmental and social sustainability into tourism projects. For example, we're doing projects around in Central Asia, around Almaty, Bishkek, for example, which are looking at how to involve local communities, take advantage of local skills. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, we're doing a lot of work. We're helping a lot of building up the basis for renewed tourism and through health protocols, through governments collaborating and working closely with each other. In the Pacific, again, as Sarah mentioned, we're working closely with the SPTO to build up the knowledge base, which will help countries move towards the regenerative future that they've already, that they want to move towards. We continue to support them in any way that we can. We have a number of instruments. As I said, there's always knowledge, there's capacity building, and we're very eager to work with SPTO and with other partners in the region to make sure that the ADB, that the region moves forward along the path that it chooses for itself, and one which is environmentally and socially sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashish. And maybe before I hand over to Bama to close this webinar, because we already have 11:17 here in Manila, maybe a few last words about the role of these scenarios in future thinking. Ian, already mentioned, we often see all these scenarios happening at the same time, and parts of it. Important is to use additional future thinking foresight tools like backcasting, and then kind of create an understanding of what kind of milestones, what kind of indicators we have to watch out for to actually see a move towards the kind of preferred scenario that we want to see, and that is the regenerative one. So the scenarios help create that awareness. They help us to understand the uncertainties that we have to navigate. They also help us to understand what kind of policies we have to build on. And I believe it's a great tool for ADB to engage with government, of course, with the regional collaboration platforms to advance this kind of work and thinking. And one great example, and an unfortunate example, is of course COVID. So if we had listened to some of Ian's papers earlier, a couple of years back, on the possible impact of pandemics, maybe we would have all been a lot better prepared. So with that, I'm handing over to Bama to close this webinar. And I thank all of you here, experts and speakers, that you made time to contribute. I see there are a few more questions coming in. Please try to answer them. And for the audience, we will make a recording available. And please also watch out for all the knowledge products and blogs and papers that are coming out and have come out already on the topic. So thank you very much, Bama. Over to you. And I'd like to also thank Bama for leading the overall coordination of this webinar. She leads also ADB's Future and Foresight Club, and many of the activities we have on future thinking and foresight with UNESCO, with OECD, and many others.
Thank you to all speakers and to all our participants for joining us today on this ADB Futures Club meeting. It was organized with our Pacific Department and Victoria University of Wellington. Just for your information, ADB Futures Club was established very recently, just 3 months ago, and it was our first meeting for this year. We will continue to organize knowledge sharing events to present the value of strategic foresight, how it can be used, and how it can help in your work for stakeholder engagement, change management, risk management, and in the planning process. But most importantly, we hope you had a quick overview of how the strategic foresight tools such as scenario building can be used in the planning and then in navigating uncertainties. It has been successfully used in transformative programs, and especially to disrupt our current way of thinking, to help us envision alternative scenarios and to be better prepared for unpredictable uncertainties. And the recording of today's session will be shared to all participants in our YouTube channel. And if you are interested to find out more about the Foresight or ADB Futures Club and how we can help you to apply these tools in your work, please feel free to contact us. And if you want to stay up to date with our upcoming events, please follow us on ADB Knowledge and Innovation page on LinkedIn and our social media sites. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.